Welcome everybody to the Analytics Think Tank Roundtable about exploring the ins and outs of scaling analytics and AI. A very interesting topic, especially from someone that is coming from both academia and a practitioner side, because this is scaling analytics is something that we really struggle with, given that as an academic, we only have students for a limited amount of time. And then as a practitioner, we need more efficient ways of managing our analytics. So we're very excited that you're able to make it today. I know that there have been a lot of people out. Okay, our agenda today is, of course, we're going to welcome everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of scaling analytics, and more specifically, what does that even mean? And so Eric's going to talk us through that a little bit from Access Group. Then we're going to have our panel consisting of 4 awesome professionals. So the panel is going to talk about the topic around 3 structured questions around the analytics scaling topic, and then we're going to break into rooms. And your discussion lead, each room will have someone that will lead the conversation in a more intimate setting to hear from you specifically about your thoughts around scaling analytics. Then we'll regroup as a larger group, and Mike and I will talk about some of the common themes that came out of your conversations. Before we go through some closing remarks, we talk about our next events and different types of closing comments. So Eric from Access Group, do you want to talk to us about scaling analytics and what it means?
So I'm going to go in a slightly different direction than you might expect. I don't want to go into some of the initially some of the technical aspects of what has to be addressed with a scalability strategy, but I want to focus on the strategy itself. In other words, when you think about scalability, think of it like any other governance process for data quality or compliance. It should really be an effect that has to be given to a solution that's achieving some sort of business goal. Scalability has to be part of the data strategy that's delivering a business solution, a business outcome. And that means when you think in those terms, it's a dynamic, it's a fluid environment, because business needs are always evolving. And there are obviously certain milestones. I mean, you will need KPIs, you will need to have core metrics involved, but when you're looking at the challenges of applying analytics at scale, you're constantly modifying the algorithms. You're constantly encompassing larger data sets. You're constantly trying to enable data scientists and in some environments, citizen developers, to create more value through analytics by having just-in-time quality data. And you're going to have to make sure that the supporting systems will help them in that journey. If you start having this kind of outcome-based approach, you'll see that even companies, when we have Ira speak about what they're doing within their work at Anadot, they're getting much more involved with correlation technologies, because the hardest part about scalability is the classic problem of most of business business planning, which is you don't know what you don't know. You have to work with what you know to a point, and then go beyond that point by empowering your organization with data and processes so you can adapt and achieve that scalability. And it might sound somewhat esoteric, but those organizations that are really investing tools to identify and catalog their data and to make their data scientists literate about that data will help them overcome the challenges when the availability, the performance of that data retrieval becomes an issue or a bottleneck. So I'm just trying to cast the largest net for us to look at how we can attack the problem as not a finite problem, but just a continuous journey that we're going to be on. And the good thing about the people on the panel today is, Ben has long history in retail, and he works at Domo, which really has to constantly evolve what the consumers, the business consumers see about those analytics. And I think everyone's going to have stories to tell about how you identify um, or, or project the need for reassessing the needs of your solutions before you hit walls. I think, talking with Ira before this call about, it's one thing to see the wall coming. Nobody wants to hit it. So you have to have a plan, a strategy that you can enact to ensure scalability. So the last member of our panel is Mike, who's the CDO at University of South Carolina, and he has to ensure the availability of data, and it has to be there for supporting the decisions the university across all campuses have to make. So I think that's the full circle of my introduction, which is think of scalability requirements as governance requirements. And if they are identified as the algorithms are being written, as they're being hosted, as they're being exercised and being executed, we'll all be better prepared for change. So those are my few thoughts, just to start off the conversation, to give us some context. And I think I'd just like to open it up to the panel now and just start, having an open conversation.
Great, thank you, Eric. So let me go through a quick introduction, or have the panelists go through a quick introduction of themselves, and then we have 3 questions that we want to talk about with you guys. And I think, like I mentioned before, this is a really interesting topic, especially for me. It's a little bit frustrating as an academic and also as a practitioner, because we to scale something means that you make it where you can do it at scale, which is more efficiently. So it's not just like a once and done thing, but it's something that you can do over and over without exhausting yourself. So that's the big challenge with analytics. And sometimes I think we feel like we've accomplished something and then that's it, but that's not it. We have to we have to keep going. This is not a sprint; it's a marathon. So that's sort of what we're talking about today. So Mike, if I can have you do a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll move to Ira, Eric, and then Eric, you've already kind of introduced yourself, and then Ben, then we'll jump into the questions.
Thank you, Beverly. I'm Mike Kelly. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the University of South Carolina system. We are a complex state institution that's actually comprised of about 8 different campuses plus our online programs. Thank you for
Awesome.
having me today.
It's such a pleasure. Ben, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Ben Shine. I serve as Vice President of Data Curiosity here at Domo. We're a data and analytics cloud platform, about 2,000 customers, including a lot of the Fortune 500 and other great people in academic institutions. And so I've been here about 4 years. Prior to that, as Eric sort of alluded to, I did spend 10 years at Target, was a Domo customer there too, but also scaling data and analytics across that organization. So bring both parts of that to this conversation, I think.
Awesome. And by far, you have the coolest title of pretty much anyone I know, VP of Data Curiosity. I love that. And then rocker, Ira Cohen.
All right, so my name is Ira Cohen. I'm the Chief Data Scientist and the co-founder of Anodot. We are a startup that deals with business monitoring and basically making it autonomous using machine learning. My background is in machine learning. I did my PhD in machine learning and computer vision in the University of Illinois.
So our first question for you guys is, what does it mean to scale analytics, and why is this important? We talked a little bit about context, but for those that are still wondering, well, what are they talking about with scaling analytics? Can you please give us what does that mean to you, panel?
Beverly, I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm going to actually start with the why important part of the question. And this is a bit of a perspective. I think that there's an implicit assumption that we're talking about larger organizations. So if you're a small mom and pop type operation, then scalability may not be so relevant. But for larger organizations, they take on their own culture. They have usually very diverse, what we refer to as domains of data. And from my perspective, the best and most meaningful analytics come from mashing up different data sources. I'll date myself a little bit with a reference that I use somewhat frequently to a 1970s commercial series by Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, which is two klutzy people either sitting on a couch together or walking down the sidewalk, and one of them accidentally gets peanut butter on the other person's chocolate or vice versa, and they stand there and they accuse each other. But what they end up with in the end is a better candy bar, something that they're both enthusiastic about. And to me, that's a big part of what's important here with scaling analytics, is the ability to pull different data sources together and really get to an interesting story, one that's hopefully actionable to improve the business or organization.
Analytics for me, and first of all, why is it important? Because I think every decision done in an organization should be done, or a lot of businesses should be using their data. So any decision an organization makes should be based on their data, and analytics is the way to get the insights from the data. Without it, it's just data sitting around in files or databases or data lakes. So it's really important. And as Mike mentioned, the bigger the organization, the more complex it is, the more data there is to collect. And any business that does not scale their analytics and does not base their decisions on solid data is going to lose to their competitors. So I think it's super important for any business.
Yeah, I want to kind of chime in. I agree that you start with the data, and I think at scale for me means you understand the analytics lifecycle. You really have to understand that you need access to the data, has to be quality data, has to be secure data, and then gets to the point that Mike just raised. Well, yes, in the context of this line of business, I'm fine, but now I'm going to work cross-organizationally. Well, now I have to re-examine availability of the data, access rights to the data, and the overall security. And now I'm going to have a new consumer face to this, and so on. So the life cycle, you want this thing to have a long life, but you have to have that modularity, that architectural view, like that, like I said, that data strategy that overlays your business solutions. And that's the outcome that you're going to be looking for, is delivering that business solution. And that itself is kind of a North Star, because things will get in the way, pesky things you can't quite plan for, a very successful product release, a pandemic, things like that. So I just get back to that flexibility, but you really do have to have foundational knowledge, like I was talking about. You really have to understand your data and the metadata about your data. And one last thing, because I like to talk about later, is the metadata you create during the process of analytics. All of these things are pretty important.
Yeah, I could have a whole conversation about that. I think, maybe adding on a little bit to this idea of what does scale really mean, and even what does scale mean, even at a smaller organization or a larger organization. I think a couple concepts that I always gravitate towards around scale. One is that scaling really means that data and analytics can be for everyone, not just for your top priorities, right? So even certainly at large companies, we throw a lot of resources at the most important priorities, right? But I often say when you hear about digital transformation or data democratization, there's often sort of this invisible asterisk on there, that the asterisk is if you're working on priority 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we can put all these resources on it. So if you're on priority number 10 or 11 or 20, which still is really valuable, that might have been theft protection at Target, right? Not the headline thing being talked about in the earnings call. How do you scale so that it's not just about scaling for the big priorities, but sort of extending this long tail of analytics? And I think part of that is also about, we often use this concept of BI leverage in talking about Domo, but to me, it's about how do I leverage my resources, right? How do I make sure that I don't always need an engineer, but I am also not sending, data science, sort of citizen developers or citizen BI people without any governance and without any sort of control and connectivity back there. So I think both those things in terms of making it for everyone and for making it easy, but also making sure that I'm leveraging both sets of skills. They're all different skills I have. I mean, I think that can be true certainly at very large organizations, but even at smaller organizations, that's also the case.
Okay, great. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I think beyond the accessibility of the data and the analytics tools to all the organization, I think one big aspect of it that we see, at least in the monitoring space, but I think it's not just in that space, is that even if you could make the data accessible to everybody could get to the data with the governance around it. A lot of the analytics tools require somebody to know how to ask, which question to ask, and getting the insights out of the data. So the data by itself is just data. It doesn't show you the information. You have to ask it questions to actually get the insights out of it. So part of the scaling is actually putting in the tools that allow you to get insights much faster, much easier, and a lot more of them. So because you have a lot more data, you have a lot more access to a lot more data, and you can connect the dot between one BU and another BU with, for example, with correlation. A correlation could help you understand that there is an insight to be gained between two different line of businesses in the same organization. So putting in the tools that actually automate a lot of the querying processes and what questions to ask and where to connect the dots, that's really critical for scaling. Otherwise, you're just pushing a lot access to a lot of data to a lot of people, but they still have the tools from 10 years ago, and they can't really know what data to access and how to get the insights out of all that wealth of data.
Yeah, love it.
Actually,
just a quick point of clarification before you comment is I just want to make sure that we're focused on scaling analytics, because I know we've talked a lot about making data efficient and scaling with our data. So I just want to make sure we're talking about scaling analytics, just to give a little more structure to the panel. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's good. And actually, I was coming back to that from the point Ira just made about it. When you talk about scaling analytics, sometimes you always think there's somebody you're giving the analytics to, but increasingly with intelligent automation, it could be robotic process automation. There could be some other downstream system that's going to take action, that you enable it to take some action that can have some business logic within that engine downstream. That's another thing that'll allow analytics to scale. But this becomes a higher stakes game, because any flaw or limitations in the scaling of the analytics work can have an amplified effect downstream with those automation tools. So you have to think about constant rigorous monitoring of the effect of your analytics, because as I said earlier, you don't know sometimes new variables that you have to account for, and everything may seem quite healthy at a certain level, and then it may seem quite unhealthy at a larger volume. You just have to have that diligence. But I think that's an interesting. Intelligent automation is the scale of the output of analytics, and that will augment what people can do with the analytics insights.
Great points. Just let me summarize real quick, and then you can add to Mike, and then we'll move to the next question, if you don't mind. So some of the things that we've heard so far have to do with this notion, and I'm going to pick on the end first and then go backwards, because I think that last point was a really good one that Eric just made, and some of the others. But that oftentimes when you think about producing an analytic, you think about answering a specific business question for a specific person. But with scaling analytics, it's more broader, and I'm not going to say it's for everyone, but your questions have to be such that you're answering not just a once and done. Once and dones will get you in analytics. You can get in big trouble if your whole department is once and dones. So that it's elongating your view and developing this bigger vision for your analytics. Someone mentioned a long tail, broader application areas for everyone. Your architecture has to be established to enable this sort of thing, your analytics architecture, not just your data architecture. The best results are typically from multiple data sets. I like the Reese's example. there's emphasis on things like ease. It's not supposed to be so complex that you can't scale it, but the ease, and nobody said this directly, but I kept hearing between the lines this notion of transparency. Like it's not just for that, like that one analyst or that one group or the couple of people that are really working on it know what's going on, but nobody else is a black box. There's got to be transparency for your analytics to really be scalable. And again, nobody really said that, but I felt that you guys were thinking it. And then the push button, the tools, the automation that should be in place in order to better enable the scalable analytics. And then Mike, you want to put the cherry on top before we move to the next question?
Well, that's a daunting challenge. I guess I just want to speak to culture for a quick minute.
Yes.
That again, scalability is partly about the culture of a significant sized organization. And as was mentioned, there's those who develop analytics and those who are decision makers that are using the analytics. And part of the cultural transformation that has to happen for scalability is the developers are in community with each other because they understand the data that might come from their shop, but they may not understand data from another shop. So they need to be in community with each other. But then they also have to be in regular communication and what I would call iterative clarification with the decision makers. Am I really developing the thing that you're looking for? Am I understanding the question that you're asking? And that's, again, not just a one and done, but an ongoing basis. Like you have to, you don't just launch analytics and be done with it. You got to continually come back to it and say, do we need to tweak the algorithm? Do we need to tweak the underlying part? And that becomes part of the culture as well.
That's very good. Thank you. And that sort of ties in because I sort of pictured the data scientists like getting to the finish line and being exhausted and like, okay, I'm done. And we can't think that way. But that brings me to the second question, which is now that we have a better understanding of the context and what it means to even scale analytics and why it's important to not just have a bunch of once and done, answering the same kind of questions over and over again and the efficiency that comes from scaling analytics. Now that we understand the importance, definition, and the context and what it really means, why is this so hard? This is hard. Why is this so hard? What are some of the big barriers that you guys are seeing that prevent us from really scaling analytics in the way that we need to?
I would say one word, dependency. Right? That is, I think, at the crux when we create, and look, you're always going to have dependencies between teams and specialization and stuff like that. But too often, it's really what I've seen at Target and other large organizations I worked with is when we create too much dependency, right? When someone, and it's sort of a funny thing because you don't, like, again, you want to be able to rely on other teams and stuff, but when you create all these dependencies where I can only do this much and then I hit a wall and I need an engineer or I need an architect or whatever it is, that's where the scale breaks down because then I have some sort of bottleneck somewhere. And so the more I can reduce dependency, create an ecosystem where I am letting people be accountable, right? Because that reverses, if I'm not dependent upon someone, I need to be accountable for it. And so I think those are some of even the cultural elements, but also that you can then have software that builds that kind of reduction of dependency. But I think when it breaks down, and people might not always use that word, but they might feel it differently. But it's often, I think, if you really unpack what's going on when you see like a place that's either failed to scale or there's frustration at that scale, it comes down to that too much dependency and not enough reduction of that dependency.
I like that. And I just want to go back to something Mike said earlier, because he said it more than once, which is culture. When you started talking about why is it so hard, it involves firing on all cylinders with people, process, technology, and I would say even programs, because you want to make sure that they're all aligned. And that is very hard to map out. It's very hard to get moving. It's very hard to sustain momentum. And it's very hard to accommodate change, but you have to do all those things. And I think that's the thing you mentioned earlier yourself, Beverly, about transparency. That's critical because if you're going to take that knowledge that you're generating with the data scientists, they have to have an understanding of the business. The business has to share. Traditionally, data scientists live in shared services, and the business calls on them opportunistically and shields themselves from them at other times. You have to break down those kind of barriers, and that's very hard. That's cultural. But just as I was saying, foundationally, we understand the data and the quality and the data sets, and now some concepts of reuse. That's very hard, but very, very rewarding. So it's another mindset change that you want to have additive knowledge over time with analytics. Not those one and done type of things, which have historically been the ones that have been rewarded. And that's very hard to change that mindset. So I think that one of the things, it always comes back to the people. And how do you influence the change in the people?
System where I'm a data scientist or I'm an analyst, I come to the system, I create a query, I get an answer or get a set of answers, and I could repeat this process. I can, of course, it's not a one-off. I have to do it over and over again. But the problem with that is that with now that we're collecting all the data, putting it in data lakes, making it accessible, trying to break down the barriers, and I agree with the challenge of the dependencies, trying to break those down. Even if you're successful, you're still stuck with your limited ability to ask the questions. And one of the things that I think machine learning brings to the table, and I'm a machine learning guy, so I always push towards the automation that machine learning gives, is the ability it has the ability in certain circumstances to create the questions, give and present you with a lot of answers. I'll give you an example from our domain. We deal with in monitoring, business monitoring. So basically, we collect millions of metrics constantly from every customer. Our largest one has 10 billion metrics. They collect every minute from the entire organization, everything from revenues to systems to whatnot. Of course, and our system uses machine learning to basically ask us one question. We ask a single question, which is there a problem right now in any of these metrics or any of the area of the business? So building it is hard, but it provides a lot of answers constantly to all the organization. And now the scaling challenge is, okay, I have all these answers. Which ones are the most important to me to deal with right now? So some automate AI gave me all the answers of all the questions I could ever think about. How do I pick and choose the ones to pay attention to? And that's the next kind of challenge that, when you implement machine learning for certain domains, the next challenge would be, okay, now I have a wealth of answers, a wealth of insights. How do I prioritize them? So that's kind of, in some organization, the next level of challenge for scaling.
Yeah, I sometimes talk about it as you started out, we used to search for a needle in a haystack, and now I have a pile of needles, and I need to know which one I need to solve my problem, right? And both are challenges, exactly. and also depending on personality and culture, some cultures might actually like looking for a needle in the haystack better than figuring out which needle to use, right? Even though you have so much more, that chaos and that messiness, can turn some people off. So I think it's an interesting dynamic, and a lot of what you were saying, Ira. So
that's a good visual. I like that. So some of the challenges that we've heard so far are there's too much dependency. The culture isn't necessarily right. The need for sharing isn't there, and that's kind of ties in with culture. We talked about silos and not being able to break down those silos. And we also talked about the relationship, and I sort of see it as a triad. This wasn't specifically said, but just to add to it a little bit, I think it's sort of business, IT, and data science or analytics. So that analytics, IT, and business being able to have the right relationship where you can scale analytics, and then making it a priority. It sounds like those are some pretty big barriers. And one thing you guys are not saying, because I think you're being nice, but I think I see it. I'm just going to say it is I think there's some mentality still that there's a little bit of information is power, or people don't want to share their analytics. They don't want to share their models. That's theirs. And, maybe they don't want it to be transparent. Maybe they don't want their code to be reused. I mean, gosh, it's like very personal. I remember this one model in particular, I was emotionally, y'all are going to learn how strange I am, but I was emotionally attached to this model. I had spent months on it and I loved it. It was such a beautiful, it wasn't a single model. It was like this big, thing. And I loved that. It was an enterprise guide and it was just beautiful. And I hated having to end that project. And the idea of someone else sort of getting in there and digging at it and looking at my notes and being able to take that and leverage it in another way for the organization where I worked, it's both flattering and offensive. And so I think when we talk about culture and we talk about silos and this notion of sharing and breaking down, the barriers and the walls, I think there's some of that too that's going on, that where it's, it's mine. What do you guys think? Am I making that up? Is that just me?
Beverly, I think you're spot on. Like, one of the first things that came to mind for me is the power of a silo and being seen as the expert. I want to be seen as the expert, so I'm going to have people keep coming back to me to answer that question, because that keeps me front and center in their mind. If they can go do this for themselves, if they can look at a dashboard and build things out, or talk to a person in their own department, then I may not matter as much. So there's a very human element to that.
Right. I think we got to watch out for that. That's something that we have to overcome. And so that brings me to the third and final question before we break out into our rooms, which is, how do we overcome some of these? I mean, these are pretty tricky barriers for us. I mean, culture, that's a huge thing. And we didn't even mention technology as a possible barrier, but I'm sure there are some technology barriers as well. So what would you guys suggest for how to overcome some of these barriers to help you get to where you can scale your analytics better?
Again, I like to focus on outcomes because that you give everyone a focus. Analytics have a purpose, the business value is demonstrable. But just to have everyone have a level of literacy, I used that word earlier in my introduction, and have a literacy about the value of the data, therefore the value of analytics against the data, is very powerful. It starts with educating people. Now, once they buy in, things like technology platforms that enable that, what the repositories for it, they come into play. And then solutioning comes into play in the architecture, as you mentioned earlier. And then it gets easier to start saying, okay, let's put something in operation. But if you do it this way, and you understand how you're qualifying the outcome, the usage, the instantiation, each one of those steps requires a little bit of scaling reflection, like I said earlier, because Ira's right about the things you can do with data lakes today are amazing, but not all solutions will scale the same way with the data lake. Some will suffer from performance latency where others won't. So you have to start thinking, how do you want to view that data, or how do you want to generate that data for use? Even if it's a placeholder, it'll make the conversation later easier. If you use a common view and understanding, the lineage of how that data got into the view, that's going to pay off in spades later on. So I'm just trying to say that there are ways out of this. I would not start with the technology. I would start with the common vision and work back from it, because in the end, you could do everything right, and if it doesn't resonate with the business, it was wrong.
Yeah, I think similarly to what you were saying, Beverly, in terms of sort of the emotional side of things, I think what I often find is, even if you have, the technical setup to be more agile, to respond to this, to scale, you have to remember, people have sort of lived through 20 years of broken promises and being told that this system is going to work, right? No one shows up, and I'm at a software vendor. No one shows up and says, hey, this is never going to scale for you guys. Have fun, right? Like, you think it's going to work, and then they've been let down. So just saying, here's this new tool, and thinking that that's going to be it. Like, there's sort of this emotional, almost like a data therapy process, right? To help them understand what's different. How can we do things together differently? That it makes sense to ask a question because I could actually do something. And if you ignore that part of it, doesn't matter how good the solution is, you're going to end up with a bunch of people that are just doing it or just exporting to Excel or whatever they used to do. So I think that's my piece of it. Is you have to be sort of a data therapist and get people out of that trauma they've had, maybe.
Yeah,
Another
I probably
aspect.
shouldn't use this.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say I probably shouldn't use this term, but I sometimes call it analytics anonymous. But yeah, data therapist. I like that. Ira?
Yeah, so Ben has the coolest ways around data, right? So data therapist, I'm gonna adopt that. VP of data, what was it?
Curiosity.
Oh, it's amazing. So one of the ways I think to get out of some of these challenges is to first find the ways to break down the barriers between the different organizations. So, for example, I mean, find a use case. In our case, for example, the monitoring use case, it's very easy because what tends to happen? There is some incident, something happens within a company. We see this day in, day out. So last week there was some issue in a company and they saw revenue drop from from one of their games, and now there is a team in charge of revenues. They're panicking. What is happening? They want they want to know why this is happening. Now they can point the finger to almost anybody outside the company and inside the company. Their IT and their R&D, their networking guys or their marketing guys not paying for ads all of a sudden. So if you show them that the analytics can give you the answer quickly and give you the value to your problem beyond your siloed organization, then they start becoming more open to doing more analytics that is cross. So finding those cases that you get high value out of the collaboration, out of the correlation between the different silos of the organization, basically starts getting everybody used to working this way. And then you start pushing it down to other types of scenarios that maybe it's not that obvious from the start, but you start seeing it after you do it.
Mm-hmm. So don't just tell me, but show me. Like, let me see that this is a better way to go, more efficient.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
can get faster answers, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, panel. Wonderful. Any final piece of advice that anybody would like to offer forward before we move to our smaller groups?
Beverly, I'll just jump in with another touch point on the fostering data culture. I think the leadership example is really important, where at the very top of the organization, they routinely go to a baseline prompt in any conversation. What did the data tell us? The topic doesn't matter. It could be employee PTO policy, it could be product development, accounts receivable, doesn't matter. But asking that question routinely until it becomes second nature really helps cast a spotlight throughout the organization. Be thinking about data, be mindful of the data as we move forward.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm putting that in the chat. Other final piece of advice from the panel?
Be patient. It is hard, right? So if you think it's simple or quick, it's not going to be. So it can be hard.
I think the saving grace is, Ben had mentioned earlier, don't overpromise and underdeliver. So it is iterative. It's good to show some value and additively show that you're trending in the direction of adding more value, and things will get better. But there's no big bang, there's no silver bullet. Be careful about being too audacious. Just, build a following and build a practice.
Great. These are great pieces of advice. Wonderful. I heard some really interesting conversations going on, and I've got 4 points that I kept hearing the same handful of things over and over again that I'll cover in a second. But before, and then Mike, you probably have some things that you wanted to summarize as main themes as well. But before we do that, which group would like to share some of their team's content?
Well, I'll just take a minute. When our team broke out, it just organically started with kind of this cross-organizational scaling for analytics. And the key things that the conversation encompassed were the understanding of buying in of leadership, organizational maturity, being ready for scaling and change, having that ecosystem, because it takes a village, right? And then obviously the word culture keeps coming up. So those are the few things that we want to capture.
Great. So you guys talked about cross-org scaling, leadership buy-in. I like that. Organizational maturity has a lot to do with the ability to even scale the ecosystem, and of course, culture. I think culture is going to be king on this one. Brian, how'd you guys talk?
Yeah, so we certainly heard very similar things in terms of, as we get to the latter part of the conversation, we said the consequences of this, right? We miss deadlines, we lose trust. And when you're trying to build a culture of analytics, those things are deadly to your initiative. So we sort of asked the question, how do we make analytics part of the fabric of strategic initiatives versus thought of as one and done opportunities? And so there's, obviously a cultural communication piece of that, right? Ingraining it, I think, is a great word. We said, making every analytics a part of everyday conversation. And the way you've arrived is when you hear people outside of the analytics community talking in analytical terms. And so that's the sort of, you've sort of begun to shift the tides when you hear that. And so lots of great discussion around all of that. But analytics are built around business arguments and really trying to make that part of the culture, ingraining it into the fabric. I think that's a great way to capture it.
Yes. I love that. Like if you're walking around and you hear senior leaders using terms that you normally only hear from data scientists or from the analytics teams, that you've arrived, so to speak, and you've at least made some progress. So that's great. Other discussion leads willing to share? Autumn.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we centered more around the challenges with really scaling analytics. And it, hones back in on what Eric started with its requirements, that scaling requirements equals governance requirements. So had a bit of a lively discussion around what is data quality issues versus data integrity issues. And are those potentially caused by lack of master data management? And what about how data latency could impact some of the work that you are doing? And so those are some of the kind of things that we really were talking through, that it's important to recognize those issues and the potential impacts for scaling.
Love it. That's awesome. Let's see. I
really liked Cam in our group had a great analogy. We're talking about some of the consequences of talking about that. Often when you don't scale, it's like you're looking at half a puzzle, right? So you see this half and you don't have all the pieces. And so part of what we're trying to do is, see that full picture to make better decisions. So I thought that was, yes, and streaming sets for sure, Cam. And so I think that's which gets to latency. We also talked a little bit about just certainly the complexities of like a global organization, right? Of different skill sets, different cultures, all those things can also just, make this an even bigger challenge if you don't have consistency of skill set and those things.
Yep, that's awesome. Boy, what a great list we have here. And then Alex, Ron, I think you guys were in the same room.
So, what are some of the challenging barriers? One that was surfaced was unclear data strategy. So if you don't have a clear idea of what problem you're trying to solve with the data, then it's going to be hard to scale that. So you have to understand the problem. And another barrier is, lack of understanding of what data is available and where to consume that from, and the governance around it, definition, stewardship, quality. Getting that foundation is a huge challenge and can be a barrier to scaling. And if you don't scale, some of the consequences of that include, high costs. So if we develop a model from scratch each time and have to figure out where the data is from, then there's significant cost. And, scaling is about thinking more generally so we can amortize the cost down across the many different models that are going to be done. One of the things that was reflected on is that most of the time, maybe 90% of the time, models don't make it into production. And there's a certain amount of reflection that we all have to do about why that is the case. And, perhaps that's that the foundation for scaling wasn't there, as was just mentioned, or even that that people who know how to create scalable analytics models as opposed to one-off customization models are fairly few and far between, as opposed to analysts who can create a one and done and go into some rabbit hole and get the data they need. But creating the scalable analytics is just a much more challenging thing in terms of the caliber of people that are required. And then how do you tell when a company has embraced and truly scaled analytics? Is that it's a C-suite and board level conversation so that you have support from the top. And I'm not just talking about the CTO or CIO, but other folk who have a hand in the business, so that what is the data telling us as a leading conversation becomes a common thing in the organization. And when that data becomes known and pervasive, then that creates a culture which can support scaling.
Okay, Ron, you're the winner of the prize of nothing other than maybe my reaction of a heart, because you're the first person to mention that the problem that we have is even before scaling, we can't even operationalize most analytics solutions anymore, or yet. We haven't gotten to the point where the majority of analytics solutions are even operationalized, not to mention scaled. So yes, we're dealing with that as well. Awesome conversations. Thank you again to our discussion leaders. Mike, I have a few main themes that I wanted to cover, and I would love to hear yours as well, of course. And so the few things that I've heard, guys, I was sort of poking into each of the rooms and listening to all these incredibly rich and powerful conversations. And a few things that I had heard, some of them made me a little bit sad, but one was, does this only apply to big organizations? Like can this apply to, does this idea of even wanting to scale analytics, does this apply to smaller organizations, or does this even matter for organizations that are less mature? I don't have any answers. I'm just telling you some of the common themes that I'd heard is the questioning behind, does this still matter for smaller or less mature organizations? A second theme that I heard is how can I start with the once and done? Like, we know how to do the once and done, and to Ron's point, like that's not as a harder skill is to find people that know how to create scalable solutions. But can we start with the once and done? Like, maybe we start there as a base point and develop a way of a mechanism or a process for developing more scalable solutions. The third thing I heard is around the reward system. So the reward system is interesting because if you come up with this awesome model or these great insights to answer some specific business question, you are like the hero. You're like, as we say in the university, BMOC, you're the big man on campus, and how do we, if you create some great vanilla thing that you can then tweak and start customizing that's more scalable, you're not going to be the BMOC. So the reward systems kind of encourage us in the wrong direction of this rocky road with sprinkles and syrup, and it's very, very specific for a very specific need, but it's not really scalable. So that reward system, something about that. And then the fourth theme that I'd heard is around the user expectations. There doesn't seem to exist a user expectation yet where you would have scalable analytics. They don't think about like, oh, well, didn't you just do a segmentation for that group? Can we start with that and modify it for this? It's like there's this expectation for some reason of always starting from ground zero and not trying to build anything, off of something else. So that's also an interesting, again, no answers, just some themes that I picked up along the conversations. Mike Kelly?
I'm not sure I did a fantastic job of picking up some common themes, but I'm going to cherry pick a couple conversations that I dropped in on, and timing is everything, I guess. In room 4, they were talking about the distribution of skill sets throughout an organization. And I think that, at least within our own organization, we can see this as a little bit, the old thing of the haves and the have-nots. In analytics, it's more of the can and the cannots, because you do or don't have the skill sets, you do or do not have the time, talent, and treasure to invest in analytics capabilities. So being mindful of that distribution of skill sets throughout the organization. For me, that also invokes a question of like, what can be centralized, what can and should be centralized in terms of enabling analytics throughout the organization, and then where is analytics actually being performed, developed, and whatnot. Another really good topic of conversation from a different room was kind of, you don't start big, you start somewhere. So the once and done might be the thing that plants the seed. And that then leads to an ecosystem through a process of evolution and maturity. So embrace the one and dones, don't be dismissive of them, but embrace them as kind of getting the toehold in where you can go from there, but also be wary of the ongoing one and dones, right? When you get into this pattern of, hey, we just spent money with this outfit to do analytics study of X, Y, or Z for us. Now we're investing money with this other outfit to study this topic. You're missing the boat. You're not achieving analytics at scale. You're just exploring forest fires, not necessarily even putting them out. You got to really build the infrastructure and enable it throughout the organization.
I love it. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate those summary comments from you. Y'all, this has been a really nice session. I really appreciate the panelists. Round of applause. See how it's a circle? Round of applause for the panelists. Round of applause for the discussion leads. And just real quickly, we're going to cover a few things that we have coming up, because if you like to learn and network, here are some other options for you. University of South Carolina has partnered with University of Georgia and Informs. And if you're not familiar with Informs, please get familiar with Informs. There's a very, very cool, big organization, Institute for Operations Research Management Science. They offer a certified analytics professional designation. That's the CAP right here behind my name. And this course is intended to help prep people for that. It's called Essentials of Data Science, Core Skills for Analytics Certification, April 11 through 13. This program will be done in Atlanta in the Buckhead area. A second announcement is thank you, Ron, for being my inaugural guest on Analytics Out Loud, the podcast for University of South Carolina that talks about analytics. And what's unique about this one is we partner a professor with a practitioner, and the professor kind of talks about their research stream and the conceptual, and the practitioner talks about real world and some of the things that would apply, and how you would apply these sort of concepts, or how you couldn't apply some of these concepts. And so the contrast and the comparison between the two is always an interesting conversation. Third announcement is we at Access Group have partnered with TAG, Technology Association of Georgia, to offer a learning series, which we're really pumped about. I don't think Jerry's on, but Jerry and I are working on something called the Data Thinking Workshop, where you earn a certificate of completion through TAG. There are 3 sessions. One is in February, the other in March, and then in May. Essentials of Data Literacy is the first module, leveraging analytics to extract value and solve problems, and then communicating the data science story. You complete all 3, you earn a certificate of completion from TAG Data Science and Analytics. So we're very excited about these workshops. They will be available on the TAG website very soon with details about how to register. And thanks, you guys. It's a great time to be involved in the analytics space, and we're always trying to advance, elevate the discipline, encourage collaboration, stimulate innovation. And so thank you for being a part of this community. I'm very grateful for you guys.